Welcome everybody to the 5th CEVO seminar. I think this has been a great success, and again, we're super thankful to Morten Bennetsen for having this initiative, and for Mandy Chan for making it happen, and for CEPR in general for their support. So this is the last seminar before the summer break. And we plan to start this again at some point in September, probably mid-September. So today, Raffaella Sadun is going to talk about the changing nature of the CEO job. It's a paper with Joseph Fuller, Tejas Ramdas, and Stephen Hansen. And John Van Reenen is going to chair this. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much to Raffaella for agreeing to do this, to have the last of the current session of the workshops. As a housekeeping point, just could everybody put themselves on mute so there's no interference. Use the chat function as you go through to ask questions, and then, as Andrea said, the plan is to stop from time to time to give you a chance to ask Raffaella some questions. I'll try and monitor this, so if there's clarifications, I'll try and do it as we go through. Okay, so without further ado, let's hand over to Raffaella, and let's hear about the changing nature of the CEO job.
All right, thank you, and thank you for giving me this last slot. It's been really amazing to have this seminar, and I'm also very grateful to be able to be in touch during this very tricky times. So I'm going to present a paper that is work in progress with Joe Fuller, Stephen, who's on the line, and also Tejas Ramdas, who's actually a PhD student, a great PhD student at Cornell, and he's also connected. I have to say this paper has been a little bit of a victim of COVID too, because we were making great progress in February, then COVID happened. Stephen went to do his work on the UK task force. I did my work on the Italian task force. So it's, work in progress, but hopefully we'll move it soon to a proper paper. You'll be able to read the proper paper soon. So let me just tell you why, what we care about and what's the background for this paper. The origin of this paper comes from actually a labor literature that has documented how the task content and the demand for jobs has changed over time. I'm not gonna mention all the papers. It's a very rich and super interesting literature. Author and others, Sasemoglu, recently looking at automation. But basically, it points to some really interesting stylized facts. And in particular, the fact that we see a decline in routine jobs and an increase in the share of employment and wages for jobs that have high cognitive content. Now, this is really interesting per se. It's especially interesting if you are somebody who looks at the literature information technologies, because one message of this literature is that this change in demand is coming from, or it's at least related to the adoption of information technologies that lower the cost of inputs that are complementary to cognitive tasks. So this is a massive transformation that has been going on for a long time in the US economy, and also more broadly, even outside the US. What is really intriguing is that more recently, we are witnessing a shift from, it's not just cognitive tasks that are becoming more important, but it's coordination tasks, or what David Deming calls social skills. These are tasks that are complementary to cognitive tasks, but are very hard to automate. So if you like, this is the last frontier of automation. And I really, really love this paper by David Deming, the QJE from 2017, where he defines these tasks as the, basically human interaction, tasks that are high in terms of human interaction, and tasks that have this important role for what psychologists call the theory of mind. So the ability to attribute mental states to others based on your behavior. So basically putting yourself in another's shoes. Very important, often needed in situations where you have cognitive tasks, but hard to automate. Now, this, as I said, it's something that does not relate to CEOs particularly. It's something that David Deming has documented in the US, for the broad economy. This is a graph that we reproduced from his paper, where you look at the differences in employment share, but there is also mirroring in terms of wages, by occupant task intensity. The blue line that you see at the top of this graph, these are the tasks that are high in social and high in math. So this combination of social skills and cognitive skills. I'm a person who's very interested in management. And when I look at this graph, I find it particularly interesting because managerial occupations are in fact in this blue line. These are exactly the occupations where we find lots of managers. So the demand that we are posing ourselves is whether these broad changes in the economy can also be found at the very top of the hierarchy in terms of the CEO job. Now, I think that there are arguments to say that this, in a sense, why should that be the case? The CEO job has always been a very coordinative job. In fact, in work that I've done with Oriana, Steven, and Andrea, we document that lots of the time that CEOs, where does the time of a CEO go? Well, it goes in meetings, right? It goes in all these interactions and personal interactions. And actually, this wonderful book that looked at the role of the role of administrators in 1937, Barnard, also back in the days, it's always been a very coordinative job. However, there is also, I think, there are also arguments that would make us believe that perhaps there has been a change also at the top of the hierarchy. And here I'm pointing to one paper in particular, but there is also lots of anecdotal evidence that may suggest that this role of coordinative or social task may become more important also for CEOs. This is a paper by Maria Guadalupe, who might be on the line, Hanjili and Julie Wolf, 2014. Why did this paper capture our attention? Because they do something really interesting. They look at the composition of the C-suite between 1986 and 2006 for Fortune 500 companies. And what you see, if you look at this anatomy of the C-suite, is that the C-suite has become larger over time. So that already is one factor that might lead to the need for more coordination. And also there are more experts. There are more of these functional experts, which again would suggest that perhaps there is here the need to coordinate expertise and be this, if you like, the role of the CEO might be the role of a trader of expertise. And as I said, if you look at the anecdotal evidence, there is also discussion of, why should the CEO cannot be a command and control manager anymore? You really have to, use different levers to motivate and coordinate people. There is an increasing importance of intangibles, blurred firm boundaries, which sort of limit the typical command and control model, and so forth. There is a lot of this in the business literature. However, there is no direct evidence on this topic. I think that, with this paper, we want to provide some direct evidence on how the job content of CEOs, or at least the demand for CEO skills, which, as you see, it's what we can measure, has changed over time. I think that pinning down this question is important, and it's important both for management and economics. First of all, because I think it can help illuminate a really interesting issue, which is how do CEOs and firm match? On the basis of what characteristics and what skills do CEOs and firm match? And also what drives the CEO wage premium? We know that they are paid more, their wage has been increasing over time, but I think it's important to understand, can we link the wage premium to some actual differences in terms of what they do and maybe the relative scarcity of certain skills. And for those of you who are connected and are working in a business school, the explosion of team-focused courses should have captured your attention, right? There is a ton of emphasis on being a team leader, putting these MBAs in rooms because you have to understand how to work with it. Maybe there is a chance that these courses can be useful. So let's, this is like a way to look at this also business education trends. So what do we do with this project? This is the evidence that we derive comes from a large corpus of very detailed CEO job descriptions that span 17 years. And basically, these are the documents that headhunters use to go and look for CEOs. They have a rich description of the skills that are needed, the qualifications, the capabilities. I'll give you much more detail on what's in these documents. The innovation of the paper, besides the data, is in the classification approach that we use to organize free text descriptions into categories of skills and tasks that are demanded by firms over time. So here we are trying to do a connection between free text and measures that are tangible and we can observe over time. So the preliminary findings are three. There is, to some extent, cross-sectional variation in the demand for CEOs. There are differences across industries, countries, and firms. I'm going to show you some relationships for the observable firm characteristics that we have so far, but that's an area where we are pushing the research. We are planning to push the research much more. There is something that captured our interest, and I'll show you in a moment, is the fact that there is a significant increase in the demand for social skills, especially in the US. And then in the last part of the paper, the presentation, I'll show you some preliminary evidence showing you that this demand for social skills seems to be correlated to some extent with IT investments. Although that's, you know, at this moment, nothing, these are really just descriptive correlations. So this is the graph that I wanted to, that I think summarizes the findings that we have so far. I think at least the main finding that we have so far. This is a graph that shows the relative importance of 6 types of clusters of skills, and I'll tell you how we get there over time in our corpus. And the year here is the year of the CEO search. These are repeated cross-sections, obviously. It's not the same firm over time. But in these repeated cross-sections, what you see is a massive increase in the demand for social skills in these documents and a relative decrease of operational skills. Operational skills are basically things where you will see it's a firm asking for somebody who can do stuff. Or monitor or directly do stuff. The social skills are much more about these coordinative tasks and really trying to get at that state of mind idea that I presented in the first slide. So let me jump into I want to structure this talk in 3 parts. A lot of the talk will go into the data and the classification approach, and then we'll conclude with the results that we have so far.
Raffaella, should we just pause for a couple of questions if people have any questions? I know I've got a couple. But I've
got a question.
Go ahead. Shoot.
I guess so. One thing which was occurring to me is, so you're taking all this data from one company. So could it be that the clients who that company is serving how representative are they of the broader market? I guess that's one thing.
Yeah. So it really helps that this is a top 5 search firm that is a generalist. So they are not specialized in one specific segment. In fact, you will see that there is a wide variety of industries, and they're not specialized in one specific type of CEO. So from that perspective, at least, ex ante, we don't have reasons to believe that the sample would be skewed in any way. However, part of the tasks that we have now is specifically to look at the representativeness of the sample relative to the economies for which we have the data. It's obviously a tiny fraction of the economy, but we're going to check that. I don't have exactly the representatives right now.
And I guess a related thing is, are CEOs any different? I mean, you're motivated by David Deming's work, which shows a similar thing. It could be, you can imagine the CEOs are just the same as any other high-skilled occupation in that change. Do you have any thing to show it's relatively more important in the CEOs than other?
Yes, so we've got 2 things. And again, this is part of the research that is lined up more than what you're going to see today. First of all, the company gave us the C-suite, the same type of documents, but for other C-suite positions. So CFOs, CHROs, and so forth. And we have about 2,000 documents for other C-suite positions. So the first thing we can do, to some extent we started doing, is looking at whether we find similar trends also for these other C-suite positions. And in some cases, it's the same company. So I think it's going to be really interesting to look, depending on how big this overlap is, we can look at the relative demand for skills in CEOs relative to other C-suite positions within the same company. It's probably going to be a small sample. Something that I think would be even more interesting would be to match this information with other data sets like Burning Glass that, at least for the US, give you a sense of the demand for general skills. And this is definitely something that we're very keen to do.
So there's a couple of questions coming up. So Heskey Bar Isaac has a couple of questions. The first question was, if social skills are becoming more important, is there a danger that that could entrench discrimination, in the sense that if one of the reasons, why minorities, women are, not so successful is because they're perceived not to have the same set of skills as the kind of people who are in the powerful positions, could this actually be a force for increased discrimination?
It's a fascinating question. I think that we should, one of the things that we want to do is to actually check what's the selection of the CEOs in terms of gender. And I think that Heskey might be right in the sense that the more we push selection towards attributes that we cannot measure with precision, we leave more subjectivity to the process. And we know that this is one area where biases might come through. So unfortunately, we don't know yet, but I think that it becomes basically selection becomes more and more on attributes that are hard to compare objectively. So that's potentially a danger.
Guido Friebel asked the question: to what extent do you think the change in demand for social skills could be an expression of changing preferences of workers or employees, rather than a technological change?
So again, right now we really don't know. Right now we are at the point in which we want to consider different stories, and definitely the point of preferences of employees, it's a very important one. And it's something that the headhunting firm itself proposed as one of the possible reasons for this change. Right. It goes back to the idea that you cannot really command and control anymore. And you have to realize that the workforce is changing, and the way in which you control the workforce also changes over time.
So there's lots of questions coming in, but I want to give you a chance to get into the paper. So do you want to continue, and then we'll take a break later on and let's do that. Some more questions.
Okay, so let me first of all give you a sense of what executive search firms are, some of you might have encountered them in the search for deans, or they're going everywhere these days. It's a very an Economist article from February 2020 just now. The claim was that corporate headhunters are more powerful than ever. Not only they are used almost ubiquitously in large companies, Fortune 250, FTSE 100, that pay headhunters to find their CEOs, even if the appointment is internal. So this is an important point. Even if you want to consider an internal candidate, you would call an executive search firm because they would help you benchmark this internal candidate with external candidates. And also they are used also by not-for-profit organizations, which I think it's actually going back to Guido's question. This is maybe something that we can leverage. If you believe that the employees in not-for-profits might have different preferences relative to employees of for-profit organizations, this is an area that we could exploit to test for that. They use the English Premier League, hospitals, and so forth. Now, in case you don't know how the search of a CEO works, it takes anywhere between 90 days and a year. I've witnessed one actually just recently, because I was part of the board, the committee that chose the headhunter for my kids' school. That chose the principal for my kids' school. It was a really daunting experience that lasted longer than 90 days. And it's very intense in the sense that you first have to draft a document. You form a committee, first of all. Who is on this committee will vary firm to firm, but they work in cooperation with the headhunter. And the first thing they do is they craft a document where they crystallize what the company is looking for. And I have to tell you that based on my experience, that crafting of the document actually is a really interesting process where the company tries to understand what they stand for, where they want to go, and put it in writing. It's not a formal exercise, and it's also a firm-specific exercise because, although the sections might be something that are enforced by the CEO, typically the company spends time expressing their preferences in these documents. So the result is that these are very rich and firm-specific descriptions of the required competencies that the headhunter typically doesn't publish. These are private documents. Typically, where the headhunter knows candidates that might fit this bill and circulates the document among these candidates. So typically, the reason why there isn't a lot of research using this data is that typically these are private documents. The headhunter was exceptional in that sense because they gave us their entire archive. Spanning 2000 to 2017. These are 2,000 documents, which there are, especially in the earlier time period, some very short documents, which we can't use for this analysis. But in part, they gave us these documents because they also understood that they were informative, but they hadn't figured out how to use it, how to use this data. So that's what motivated the partnership. We have large firms. The median employment is 418 employees, but there is also a very large standard deviation. 17% of these firms are publicly listed, and I'll show you the country and industry dispersion. And as I was saying before, we also have, although we haven't analyzed, 2,000 job adverts for other C-suite positions. I'll show you a couple of graphs and then I can take more questions. This is the sample composition over time. So we have more information in the latter part of the sample. This is the country dispersion. So we have most of the sample is based, most of the sample is for CEO searches for the US. So this may be also non-US companies that look for CEOs for their US subsidiary. But we also have Asia to some extent, Europe, other countries that are smaller, let's say Oceania, New Zealand, and so forth. And the UK also is quite represented here. And after Brexit, we divided it from Europe. Sorry, John, but that's it is what it is. Sadly, industry composition. That's what I was referring to. I think this is one of the advantages of this sample. It's very rich in terms of industry composition. We have lots of companies in finance and services. There are also some not-for-profit like hospitals, health services, and so forth. Manufacturing. There is a little bit of everything. So this is part of the richness of this sample. I'll stop here if there are questions, John. What do you think?
Sure. Morten, you had a question on the levels. Do you want to just ask your question directly? Unmute yourself and Morten.
Sorry. Now, I was just asking about the levels. I mean, you showed this very nice graph on the relative development, but where are they in relationship?
I'll get there, Morten. It's one of the last graphs, but just to preview, the changes are also in terms of absolute terms. So the social skills have overcome operational skills also once you look at the absolute magnitudes.
So Heskey has got a question. I'll let him ask it directly.
On fire.
I know. I'm going to let him ask. He can ask it himself. It's on the internal hires. So why don't you go ahead, Heskey?
I'd be really curious to break this out into jobs that eventually get hired internally or externally. And what I'm really worried about is ads that are written with someone very specific in mind.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. We're doing this. It's a very painful exercise because we have to manually check who has been hired. So we are in the process of doing that. That's it's also, you know, the same exercise that we're doing to see if it's more women or men, but we'll get there hopefully.
Okay, do you want to just press on? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, Raffaella, to what extent can you attribute this to the rise of the use of the recruiting companies? Because often, if it's an internal hire, you hire one of these firms just to show that you've looked at the market. So, if the ad is designed by them, is it really the company, the firms that are looking for sociable CEOs, or is it the recruiting agency?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the very complicated question to answer, in the sense that we know that to some extent for the recruiting agency, there is value in adding services. So, you know, if you say that you have to, you know, if you somehow persuade the company that they really need somebody that has this sort of mystic characteristics of being team players and, you know, great whatever, then that adds also the, you know, the potential for business. So I think that you're right that that might be a risk, that the increase in social skills is driven by the recruiting firm. At the same time, we probed this with them because we were concerned too. And I think I am convinced that there is a lot of the firm that comes into this, that transpires in these documents, also because we see that there is variation, right? So the changes, the demand for the different skills actually vary to some extent according to firm characteristics, to the industry, to the country. So it doesn't seem to be completely, you know, if it was just imposed by the company, I wouldn't expect to see all this variation, let's put it this way. But I think you're right that...
The split that Eski suggested, sorry, I'm far from the mic. The split that Eski suggested can actually tell you something about that. Because if it's the company, they know they're going to hire an internal, then the search is done only by the firm as a, you know, a representative, competitive sample. And then you might see more of these social skills required when it's eventually an internal that gets hired.
Yeah, because they're trying to tailor the advert to the internal candidate. Yeah, we have to do this, right? We're not there yet, but yeah, absolutely. We have this, this is definitely on our to-do list.
I have a related question. Whether you can think of using this data to predict what kind of CEO they hire. So controlling for the characteristics of, it sounds like you've already thought about it, controlling for the characteristics of the company. Does the language predict the characteristics of the CEO, internal, external, age, previous experience, so on and so forth? That would be great because it would answer Oriana's question, and then at the same time it will tell us what are the key language components that are predictive of what the firm actually wants.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's part of this manual data collection that is taking time because the company doesn't keep track of who's actually hired. But yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Raf, do you want to go on to?
Yeah, sure. So as I was saying, great data, just a problem. As I was saying, this data is all free text. So the problem that we you know, these are snippets of text that we found in these documents. Some of them are, you know, kind of, how do you say, a little bit emotional, right? So you have the courage of your own convictions, even in the face of seemingly unsurmountable obstacles. That's like the definition of you know, a PhD student, basically. You demonstrate.
Especially one of my PhD students.
Yeah, for sure. I know that. Or, you know, you can rally your parties towards an effective, timely end result. So there is a lot of this. I mean, these are the documents. These are the sentences in the documents. So we have to solve two problems here. The first problem is, how do we take all this text and classify it into, you know, to be able to take this text and classify it in something that is amenable to quantitative analysis? We first need to find an objective and comprehensive classification of the skills and tasks that are needed to perform the job of the CEO. Because, you know, you need that type of richness in order to be able to categorize the skills. And the second step is finding a way to map the text that we find in the job adverts into these standardized categories. These are the two challenges that we had to confront to use the data. So let me tell you how we dealt with step one, finding a classification of the job of the CEO. Here our approach was to go to the ONET database, which has been widely used. And you know, the first graph that I was showing you from the Deming paper in part uses also this ONET database, which, as you know, it's a very rich classification of around 1,000 occupations that cover the entire economy. And the beauty of this data set is that every occupation, including the occupation of chief executives, C-suite managers, is broken down into dozens of components, which each component having a snippet that describes what the task is. So we take these components for the chief executive's occupation. There are 68 components. It's a little bit too much to work with 68 components, but I'll show you just as an example. We end up clustering and grouping them into 6 clusters. But just to give you a sense of what these components are, you can see that there is, you know, one would be to direct, plan, implement policies. Others are much more on the social part, persuading others to change their minds or behaviors and so forth. So it's actually quite rich, because it goes from both, it covers a wide range of tasks that, according to ONET, chief executives do in their daily life. So it's an objective classification and standardized classification of what CEOs do. And as I said, 68 is a bit too much to work with. So we, you know, another challenge that we had to solve is, how do we go from these 68 snippets into something that is a little bit more manageable, clusters, which are groups of tasks, because obviously these tasks are interconnected. So this is step one. And step two is, once you have this classification of skills, each with its own descriptions, how do we map the text in the documents to this classification, so that we can really follow the demands for that particular skill, task, or activity? And that's, you know, that's pragmatically, it's basically bunching this text into the ONET clusters. So in practice, both of these steps are essentially steps that require comparing distances between text snippets. We could do this in a very naive way, which would just be measuring word overlap. That's like a unigram approach. You just see if the same word appears in both ONET and in the documents. However, the issue is that you actually lose a lot if you do just word overlap, because you lose the semantic similarities. You know, for example, if we were to look at the word communication, and just tried for the presence of the word communication in the document, we would miss instances of talking or other synonyms of communication. So instead of using precise word overlaps, we use word embeddings, which are the analogies that instead of being just one word, a word embedding is essentially a low dimensional vector space obviously low dimensional relative to the space, to the total size of a vocabulary that represents language. What is a word embedding? It's basically for each term in a vocabulary, you have a vector of words that are semantically similar to it. It's a distance, sorry, more precisely, it's like distances from words that are semantically similar to it. How do we, in a sense, what happens is that with this approach, terms that have similar meanings will have word embeddings that lie close to each other in the vector space. I'm not going to get specifically into how these are estimated. We use a standard algorithm for constructing word embeddings, so we're not innovating on the algorithm itself. But essentially, the principle is the sentence that we reproduce here. You know a word by the company it keeps. You try to understand meaning from the surrounding word, from the words that surround a specific word. Now, if you work with word embeddings, you would know that they require a large amount of data to be estimated. And the amount of data that is needed is orders of magnitudes greater than what we have in our job ads. So the issue here is what type of collection of documents do we use to build our own language model, a model of managerial language, if you like. We started with Wikipedia, it's a standard corpora, but the words in general English are actually quite different from the words that are used in management. So instead of relying on Wikipedia, the innovation here was to digitize a corpus of, a very rich corpus of management-specific language, which is the HBR, the Harvard Business Review. It's a leading general interest management journal. We know it covers a wide range of relevant topics. I'm not going to dwell into the quality of the articles, but it's very rich. It's actually also rich in terms of the length. It's from 1922 to 2019, 50 million total words. And we estimate our word embeddings on this corpus. So this, I want to say, it's an independent contribution. It's the first embedding model of management language that we are aware. And our hope is that by creating this, this language model for management, we can actually create something that other people can also use. There is an advantage as we believe in using a specific managerial language rather than a standard language. So just to give you a sense of what that advantage might be, if you look at judgment and decision-making as a word and you use Wikipedia, the type of synonyms that you find through the word embeddings most have to do with the judicial decision-making. It's like they have a legal connotation. Whereas if you use the HBR model, although it's not perfect, you will see that there are some words that have nothing to do with decision-making, like molting. However, it's decision-making from the perspective of intuition, process, judgment, choices, rather than judging on a person from a legal perspective, it's judging from a decision-making perspective. So that's one advantage we believe that comes from using this more specific managerial language. The other advantage that we are just at the beginning of the exploration is this really beautiful feature of word embedding models, which is basically they allow you to build analogies with between words. And the typical example here is if you look at this graph, every point is a vector representation of a word. So let's take king and man, okay? And essentially the analogy equivalence comes from the fact that the distance between king and queen is similar to the distance of man and woman. Or you could do this analogy also the other way. King stands to man as queen stands to woman. And so you can start playing around with words in a way that allows you to understand relationships between concepts. I have just one graph, one table to show you on that, because again, this is probably another project, but something that is really interesting. If you start to build analogies, let's say that you estimate word embedding models for General Motors, right? So General Motors, the word embedding for General Motors stands to automobile and car, as Walt Disney stands to movies, memorabilia, and cinema. Meaning you can back out the vector for Disney by looking at the distance between General Motors and automobile. And you can repeat this with other analogies. Walmart stands to retail and retailing, the same way in which Intel stands to personal computers, computer industries, and so forth. So it's, I think it's interesting in the sense that it opens the way for a richer characterization of words, and also finding analogies between words that may be hidden in the data.
Can I ask, Raf, can I just,
Sure.
there's a lot of chat around this, and one of the questions that's coming up and also went through my mind is, this is amazing things that you're doing, especially with the HBR type of data, but can you do the whole thing just with HBR? So if you wanted to see how the CEO is changing, HBR articles are full of what the CEO does or should do. Could you also do an exercise which is just using HBR to map the changing CEO?
So yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, for example, you would be able, if you take the word embedding for CEO at the beginning of the sample, you would have probably certain words that are closer to CEOs. And it's not, it may well be that this word embedding changes over time. And so that would give you, I think from the HBR, it would give you a sense of how the meaning or the semantic similarities of the word CEOs change over time. That's one of the things that we want to do. So for example, I teach strategy. I'm very interested in understanding what strategy was 100 years ago and what strategy is today. So you can do this sort of evolution of the meaning of a word over time using the HBR corpus. It becomes a little bit harder to classify documents, however. We really needed the on-it step, because the on-it step gives us this clear demarcation between skills and tasks that was sort of fixed and we could follow over time.
So it's not, I can say, I mean, I guess I should know HBR articles better, but I can imagine there's a lot of HBR articles that just what the CEO does. And that subset of articles could be used in the way same way you're using the job adverts to try and map the evolution of the CEOs.
Yeah, we could. And, that for that, I mean, what is really fascinating is that you could use HBR to follow the evolution of any managerial concept over time.
Yes.
It's a different project.
Yeah.
But definitely you can do that. And we're planning on doing that. Let me skip through. I want to make sure that I also tell you something about the results themselves. So let me just summarize. The idea is essentially using these word embeddings to get vector representations of both the job descriptions and the on-it item descriptions, so that we can start playing with distances and we can start quantifying distances between concepts. We group the on-it items into clusters because we have a dimensionality problem, 68 clusters. They are interrelated anyway, so we want to reduce that dimensionality. And then at the last step is computing the distances between the job descriptions and these on-it clusters. Okay, so let me start with the on-it clusters. Here we use a basic k-means clustering algorithm that allows us to group together the 68 on-it items, always on the basis of the word embeddings. These 6 items, the labels are ours, so there is subjectivity in how you interpret the labels. But at a very high level, they go from strategy, which we think are the on-it snippets that have to do with setting goals, measuring progress, reacting to events, organization, which is, I call here the setting the administrative context, but it's, the organogram essentially, or the relationship of the formal organizational relationship between different units. Personnel, selecting and managing people. Information is a really interesting one, gathering, interpreting, and communicating information. Operations, and social. I'm gonna focus, underlying each of these clusters, there are different snippets of text. I'm gonna focus specifically on operations and social, because that's where we see a lot of changes over time, which is the primary object of interest for us. Operation, it's, these are the ONET snippets that define operations. A lot that has to do with doing stuff directly or monitoring closely what is being done. Making sure that there is an appropriate use of capital resources, for example, implementing budgetary control systems, controlling resources, overseeing the spending. So it's a combination of doing stuff, and there is also a connotation of financial controls, although as you see, there is also an element of controlling your own time and the time of others, another resource. Social, it's basically what you want your husband to be. It's, being aware of others' reaction, understanding why they react as they do, being able to give full attention to what other people are saying, taking time to understand, persuading, bringing others together. You see that the meaning of these clusters is very different. I mean, not the meaning, but the type of tasks are very different. That's why we call the first one operational and this one social. They have to do with very different functions and very different tasks. Once we have this classification of ONET, we then classify the text from the job descriptions into the ONET snippets of text, and ultimately into the different clusters. So it's, we define a threshold that defines if the snippet is similar to each, every sentence in the job descriptions is similar to the ONET snippets. We are playing around also with other approaches. This is one of the first ones that we tried, and seems to be robust to different thresholds and different approaches, but essentially it gives us a measure of similarity of each document, an average similarity of each document to each ONET clusters. If you want to evaluate the quality of this approach, one thing that you can do is to simply look at the sentences in the documents that are classified across the different ONET clusters. So these are sentences that the algorithm classifies into the operations cluster. And you can see that these are texts from the documents. They actually have a very strong flavor of operational tasks. Managing operation procedures, optimizing production, implementing operating and financial standards, and so forth. So this gives us some confidence that the classification approach is doing its job. On the other hand, if you look at what gets classified into social, you also see that the sentences are very different. As you would expect, you see that the documents, sentences in the documents that are classified into the social clusters have to do with very different things. Taking time to learn about and understand the way things are done here. That's the theory of mind point, taking the time to learn and understand different points of view, navigating through disagreements in a constructive manner. So this sort of check gave us some confidence that we were classifying sentences in the right buckets. We are doing, and we have done also other comparisons. I'm not gonna spend too much time in that. You can look at what doesn't get classified, mostly firm descriptions. You can also see what's the advantage of using this more complex model relative to a more basic unigram approach model, and we concluded that we actually left a lot on the table by just looking at unigrams rather than word embedding. I also want to be very clear about the fact that there are several caveats here. And I think that the main caveat that we need to confront is the fact that the job adverts themselves have changed over time. the structure. So they've become longer. There is a substitution between different clusters. That's also in absolute sense, but it's clear that the structure of the documents might be changing. So right now we are controlling for the length of the ad, but we are looking at the at different ways to to make sure that not all the results are driven by this increase in the job descriptions, in the length of the job descriptions. Should I stop here?
Yeah, should we take it? Yeah, there's a lot of questions coming through. So, Andrea, you had a question about industry specific skills versus general skills.
Oh, no, it was a boring technical question. I
Okay.
got my answer.
Okay. Catherine Thomas, you had a kind of a comment on trying to how you can maybe control for the subjectivity of the firm.
Yeah, I wondered to what extent this was a paper about CEOs or managers in general, and also the point made earlier that the search firms have an incentive to emphasize what they might be able to do differentially, which is find out the social skills by looking to see if there's been differences in CEO job descriptions relative to other positions where, other managerial positions where there might not have been such a shift in importance.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
This problem, oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, please.
No, I was going to say, well, just on a comment on this problem of the description of the CEO's job expanding in document length expanding, or it's related to, easy to have things electronically. That's exactly the same as true of burning glass technologies. If you look at that data, it's exactly the same problem that people have there, that the descriptions are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So trying to pass that out and get a relative measure is, I think, kind of, something which is important to the general issue, actually, and using this text to try and describe what people's jobs were doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. How much time do I have? About 10 minutes, more or less? Or
you've got about 15, no, you've got about 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes.
Up to 20 minutes. Okay, sounds good. So I'll just walk you through what we have so far. First of all, awards in terms of the variation. So I'm going to focus on social and operational mostly, but obviously there is some correlation in the language between the different clusters. So all the clusters are represented in the documents. There is a lot about performance, especially at the very beginning of or operations, I should say, at the beginning of the sample. They are all represented, and then there is also correlation within each cluster. So that's something to keep in mind. We match the data with a variety of sources, so the company doesn't have all this information. That's why it's taking us some time. We're matching it with Orbis and Capital IQ, Dun & Bradstreet to get a sense of firm size and public status. Hanks, because you're interested in looking at the IT angle, Bordex for team composition, and then, as I was saying, a lot of manual searches. So that's the part that is taking a lot of time. I'm going to show you mainly two things. One is a little bit about the cross-sectional variation in the demand for operational and social skills, and then this point of the changes in skill over time. So the country and industry dummies account for some of the variation. We see that it's not a huge amount. It's about 5% each independently. US firms have the lowest demand for operational skills. Europe, interestingly, the highest. So, this, going back to Oriana's point, makes us think that this is not just a blanket policy imposed by the company. There might be something here that is filtered through the firm itself. The US have the highest demand for social skills. These are US searches, not US companies, and Europe has the lowest. In terms of the industry dummies, we see that there is other things that sort of resonated with us. Operational tasks are the highest in manufacturing. and then the lowest in health and social services, for example. Although it's also important to notice that the demand for social skills, the variation across sectors is lower than the variation that we observe for operational skills. This is something that we did again to convince ourselves that there was information in the data. We calculated the routine intensity of tasks across industries. So this is a typical author and others indicators, which is defined at the occupation level. We did a very coarse aggregation at the industry level, looking at the weight of each task across different industries. And what is interesting here is that the industries that have this highest demand for operations are the ones that have a high routine, also a high routine intensity, and the vice versa for social skills. Social skills not so needed in industries that have high routine intensity. We also looked at the firm status. So one of the few firm characteristics that we have, and it's sort of clean at this point, is whether the firm is publicly listed. And we see here that the firms that are publicly listed have a lower demand for operations and a higher demand for two types of skills: social and also information. Information is this task of making sense of the world, trying to filter information and making sense of the world. Again, these are very descriptive cross-sectional correlations at this point. The other point is the issue of the time series variation. We don't have, these are repeated cross-sections, but over time there is a similar sample composition in terms of industries, the location of the searches, and whether the firm is public or not. And so what we do, we look at we explore the changes in the document language in these repeated cross-sections. This is the intensity of these different clusters of skills over time relative to 2000. And then going back to Morten's question at the beginning, this is the same graph, but looking at absolute changes. And you can see here that social skills start as the lowest, the skills demanded in these adverts, and then end up being the highest. And there is a sort of a first of a plateau, and then a corresponding decline in operational skills, starting in the second part. In the second part of the sample.
Raffaella, I might have missed it. Did you show the correlation with size? If you're a bigger firm, is it more social that you need than operational because you're just dealing with other kind of people at the top rather? I mean, here's my hypothesis. So we know over this period there's been this growth of these superstar firms, very large firms getting larger. So could part of what you're seeing here be a reflection of the kind of increasing scale of firms, and those types of firms you actually need to have a great emphasis on social skills rather than on operational skills?
Yeah, great question. Size is a really difficult beast to pin down for many US private firms, which are in our sample. So we are working on that, getting information from Orbis, Capital IQ, Dun & Bradstreet. There is a correlation right now. It's in magnitude, it's quite small, but we have to confront the fact that there is also measurement error in the size measure. So we are working on that. The other thing that we are exploring is whether there is a correlation with firm boundaries, meaning firms that engage in merger and acquisitions just before or just after the CEO search might be the ones that are in most need of these social skills, because as you know, managing mergers and acquisitions is very hard. So that's part of the ongoing data collection. I mean, we've got the data now, hopefully that now we have the time to analyze it.
Sorry, a related question is whether the change represents a change in the way firms work, or whether it's just a substitution. So as John was saying, as the firms become larger, then maybe the COO specializes in operations and the CEO does all the socializing. And that's a very different interpretation from like operations becoming less important.
So this would be looking at the firm over time, looking at the same firm over time, right, Oriana?
not necessarily. It's also looking at whether the firm has a CEO that does operations. That's what I've been wondering since the beginning, whether you're telling us that operations are becoming less important in general. So the firms do not worry about logistics anymore, they only worry about socializing. Mm-hmm. Or whether it's just a reflection of the fact that the job is split in two, basically.
Yeah.
A related thing could be outsourcing. So if increasingly firms are outsourcing the management, the kind of manufacturing and the operations, the CEOs, basically are not involved with that. They're just involved in socializing or coordinating, and the actual manufacturing part, the operational stuff, just gets outsourced to China or some other contract.
So my irrational hope here is that we can get some traction from Bordex data. Because I was hoping that, I'm hoping, and we have some overlap with that we can look also at the changes in the team composition. Whether, for example, there is this demand for social might be higher. As we know, to some extent, we know that was the case in our time use study, where CEOs spent more time interacting and in meetings when there was a COO. And so this might be, one interpretation of what we're seeing is that the team composition is changing, and therefore the allocation of tasks across the team is changing too. So again, something that I think it's great suggestions, and we will try to look at that for sure. One last thing on the one potential concern is that this might be all due to changes in the composition of the sample. This is the same type of trends, looking at trends in demand for social and operational skills, controlling for country, industry, and basic firm characteristics, at least the ones that we've coded so far. So I don't think it's really a compositional, an issue of sample composition that is driving that. But interestingly, we find much less of these trends for searchers that are based outside the US. So this seems to be something that is really prominent for searchers of CEOs, even by non-US companies, but in the US, rather than searchers in Europe. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, one aspect that we've done some work on is the relationship between these changes and the IT story. We know that IT has had pervasive effect throughout the firm. This is not just in terms of the skill composition of the workers, but also in terms of the organization of the firm. At the level of the plant, more job rotation, multitasking with fluid teams. This was, some of the earliest findings looking at IT adoption, but also the complementarities with autonomous decision-making at lower levels of the hierarchy. I think what is interesting is even in the earliest stages of the literature that was looking at how information technology would change the firm, there was also, and this is Drucker in 1967, the effective executive, mentioning the fact that the more you shift towards this objective communication, but also impersonal communication, the more the ability to make sense of the data becomes relevant. And the way in which he expressed this is actually, it's quite intriguing. Obviously, we have a lot to do to get to this page, to this point empirically, but I think even conceptually thinking about it, the fact that computerization essentially requires more effort to make sure that there is the necessary minimum of communication so that we understand each other. And we're not only receiving the goal or the numbers, but we also understand all the context that surround these numbers. And Drucker would believe that the more you would have of this codification of information through technology, actually, the more you would also need of these opportunities for effective communication. Because you exchange information, but you lose the context around that information. So this is, again, something that is very hard to test empirically. I wanted to raise it because I think it's an interesting idea. We are far, we're very far from being there. One of the things that we did was simply looking at the evolution of the IT investments of these firms during the search period, using HBR data. And we start with a validated measure, which is PCs per employees. And I think what we should do is looking at much more advanced technologies such as AI and so forth. Obviously, we don't have that data now. So I want to show you just a couple of correlations that at least I found interesting. In the first column, we have as a dependent variable the log PCs per employees. And in the sample, what you see is that the investments in PCs per employees in this overlap sample of 500 firms that overlap grows over time. Now, in column 2 and 3, the dependent variable is the operational skills. And what you see is in column 2 is that in this sample, overlapping sample with IT data, the demand for operational skills in the job documents declines over time. Now, in column 3, one way to interpret column 3 is that the decline in operational skills is especially large in the companies that make more of these IT investments, this PC, that have a higher investment in PC per employees. So there is an element of I think at this point, just correlation between what type of, the level of IT investments and the demand for CEOs. And the opposite is true, although not as strongly for the demand for social skills. That's, basic correlations where we are right now, but definitely an angle that we want to explore. One of the stories, as Guido was saying before, because there are a number of explanations that might be behind these trends. One of the explanations you already mentioned, Guido, and it's this issue of the fact that there is more demand. There are different preferences that come from employees. They may come also from investors in just being able at the top level to talk about social value, purpose, sustainability, and so forth. There is also this point, these are sentences that we got from the headhunting firm, the fact that there is also changes in the firm boundaries, so a growing number of partnerships, of alliances, supply chains, interactions, and so forth, that just demand the CEOs to play more as social leaders rather than just decision makers. And then finally, they also mentioned the idea of the technology that might be making really important exactly the type of skills that you can't automate, that you can't replicate with information technology, which is creativity, interpersonal insight, empathy, and so forth. So I'll conclude, and then if there are other questions, we can use the remaining time for that. Couple of, in terms of results, new data to document the nature and the evolution of the demand for CEOs. There is variation cross-sectionally, but more interestingly, I think there is this difference in terms of trends and this increasing importance of social skills. We want to understand what's happening here, what's driving that. One story is this IT story, but as we mentioned, we need to understand there might be a variety of factors at play here. And the other thing is we also want to understand whether this is just a CEO story or whether this is a C-suite story. So that's where the comparisons with the other C-suite searchers will be important. Underlying all this, one of the first questions that Heskey asked at the beginning, is the demand for greater social skills being met? But also more importantly, what does this imply for the way in which firms and CEOs are matched? One possibility is that if it's really that they are looking for social skills, which are hard to vet, hard to find, hard to identify, that would imply that this matching has actually become harder to do, to make over time. There is the other more malicious story, I think, that they're using these words just to continue and discriminate potential candidates, and that's at this point that's still that's a possibility. But the real hope is that over time we could get more information on this matching, and we could also understand more about the general issue of how CEOs are selected and how they're compensated. That's all we have so far.
Fantastic. So we have a few minutes left for questions and other thoughts. I mean, there's lots of stuff. I'm not going to try and pass all the things coming through. So if people have, so just on that last point, Raf, which I thought was super interesting. I mean, does that company you're working with, do they have things on the individual CEOs? I mean, typically, there's like people apply for these jobs, and there's loads of tests they do on the CEOs. You get information on them via,
yes, they do.
Could you actually see?
We're
imagine you do MRI scans on the CEO's brains.
So yes, especially in the later part of the sample, they have that. They told us something that actually is really interesting, and we want to see if we can work with them to get this data. I should say that even getting this information that we currently have is unique. They had never opened their archives. Now, the other data that I think would be really interesting is exactly as you're saying, what's their consideration set? So who's applying for these jobs, and how are these people being selected? What they told us verbally is that there is a lot of firm heterogeneity in the way in which the selection works. So obviously, it would be fantastic to be able to pin it down.
Yeah. Morton's asking, have you shared these results with the company itself, and were they surprised by the results?
Yeah, we've been sharing results with them throughout the months, and they were not surprised, but they were really interested, because I think that they had an intuition that this was happening, but they frankly they had not found a way to crack the problem of classifying the documents, and so it's very useful to talk to them, but their intuition was they were not super surprised by what we found, but it was not a given result from the outset. They didn't know what was going to be in the data.
Does anybody else want to ask any questions? Shout out now, or forever hold your peace, as they say at weddings.
So I asked this question, and it might have been answered, but I fell out and then lost all the chat. What is the relevant outcome measure for the headhunter? What is it that they deem as success? And is the way the words ads are written related to that?
Sorry, Haskell, repeat the last part. Is the word?
So, I mean, all of these, all of these things that you're measuring, are they related to success from the headhunter's perspective?
So from the headhunter perspective, it's the match that really matters.
So that means that means the quality of the match. I mean, I was just surprised that they weren't recording who they're hiring. I mean, normally you would think you would keep hold of your outcome measures, and they don't seem to be.
So, we can spend hours talking about the ways in which private companies hold their data. But there is a real question, which is, I think that they're becoming increasingly data intensive, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the way in which they collected data in the past. Even the fact that these documents could be quantified and you could get information from them, it was, I think, a new concept until last year to them. For them, the objective function is finding good and lasting matches, so that they can they will have repeat clients. That's essentially how they are, that's the business model, is that you place one CEO and the company likes it, and they will come back to you when the CEO leaves, or when you have to find another C-suite executive.
Okay, I think is that what I mean? Okay, so one very last quick question.
Yes, so it would be very helpful to know what the incentives of the headhunters are. Like, do they get paid only if they hire through them? Like, if I hire an internal candidate, do I give less money to the headhunter?
Good question, Ariana. We'll find out.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll draw proceedings, formal proceedings. I don't know if Raf, you can hang on for additional questions. Or do you have to,
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
very kind. That's very kind of you. So, but I'll close formal proceedings now, and just to remind everybody, this is the last one of the season. The next one will be on September the 14th. So watch out for the homepage over the summer for another stellar lineup of speakers. And just to thank Raffaella and her co-authors for a really superb end to this new innovation. So thank you, and all the participants very much.
Thank you.